Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik, we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. We also host a Clubhouse every Friday at 4 p.m. Eastern, and this week, along with Rabbi Mintz, we celebrate the right to question our religious authorities, especially when it comes to issues of social status and identity. So throw away your preconceptions and join us for Zelophehad's Daughters and Who is a Jew? Welcome, everybody. This week's portion has a story that is typically referred to as Zelophehad's Daughters. But I was pleasantly surprised. You'd figure because they're always called daughters that they don't have names, they don't have identities. But the Bible in Numbers 27 says the daughters of Zelophehad, son of Heifer, and then it goes and it says their names: Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. So they did have a name. And what they came to Moses for was that they did not have a father, that their father had passed away in the wilderness, and they were worried about the allotment of land in the Holy Land that was divided up amongst the 12 tribes. And they were worried that since the portion that you received was passed on from father to son, that since their father did not have a son, only had 5 daughters, that their allotment, their inheritance, their legacy would be lost. And they said, let not our father's name be lost to his clan just because he has no son. So I'm going to stop right there and ask you, Rabbi, what does this story mean to you? What is it? Is it a woman's lib story? I know this Shabbat you're going to talk about allotment of land. Is it a purely transactional story? What does it mean to you?
So, on a basic level, it's transactional, of course, just how they dividing the land. But I think that it's women's lib, but it's also the ability of people standing up to Moses and saying to Moses, this is not fair. To me, that's even more interesting. Now, the fact that it's women doing it makes it more dramatic in the 21st century. But actually, from our perspective, just the ability to stand up to Moses and to say, Moses, this isn't fair. We deserve to have our share in the land is really an amazing thing.
I love the fact that that's the point that you touched upon, because I started to think to myself, how unique is this situation? And I came up with 2 other cases. I'd be curious to know whether I missed any. But the first case is when Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, shows up in camp, so to speak, when the Jews get right out of Egypt. And there he sees his son-in-law Moses adjudicating from early in the morning till late at night. And he says to him, the thing, and this is in Exodus 18, the thing you are doing is not right. You will surely wear yourself out, and these people as well, for the task is too heavy, and you cannot do it alone. So here's a situation where maybe he doesn't confront Moses. Maybe Moses doesn't go and say, well, let me ask the boss. But ultimately, it is also of an outsider, if you consider women kind of on the fringe. Here, this father-in-law who's not Jewish uses his powers of observation and says, this is not sustainable. And the other instance, and this is an instance that we went into in detail, is right before the first Passover, when the unclean Israelites came to Moses and said, how could it be that we will not be able to experience the holiday? And that's when Moses minimally gave them Pesach Sheni, a make-up Passover, and maximally adjusted the whole calendar. So my first takeaway from your comment and from this list is this the complete list? And 2, since in each case, God or Moses was so accommodating, I say, isn't it a shame that they didn't come and ask Moses more questions and push him further?
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting take on it. It means why they stopped there.
I mean, it just shows you the power of being engaged. And these, certainly you've got to ask. And maybe that's the first lesson that we should, learn from, the daughters of Zelophehad, that if, something doesn't seem fair, something that bothers you, go ahead. And if it has to do with Judaism, we have a very receptive religion. God loves to hear from us. Write him a note. Ask him a shaila. Send in a question.
I mean, we joke about that, but that actually is what makes this story so special. The idea that you can actually ask God a question, or that Moses has to ask God a question, is something that's so surprising. That's just not the way the rabbinic system works. The rabbinic system is based on the fact that God doesn't really play a role. It's the rabbis who play the role. But here we have God. Here we have God being an integral part of making this decision.
Absolutely. The other thing that occurred to me is that all of these three instances have something in common. Unlike Korach, who was splitting hairs and making an argument, these three instances seem to have in common that they are arguments from sustainability. The argument is, this is not going to last. This is not a practice that can continue over time. So whether it's the daughters of Zelophehad who said, we've just kind of revealed a crack in the system. If this will continue, it's not even about us. It's about keeping the integrity of the tribal allotment. In the case of the Passover, it was a question about, in my mind, a big question about the Hebrew calendar and how does one fix it. And in the case of setting up a court system, clearly that was something that was, again, I think Jethro says it the clearest when he says, this can't go on. And so I'm wondering what you or anyone in the audience thinks about this question of sustainability. In other words, if we have a practice, I've brought this subject up before, for instance, the issue of taking interest on a loan. It might work in some societies, but an agrarian society where you have to buy your crops and your seeds and stuff like that, it wasn't sustainable. And even though the Bible rants against it, the rabbis went ahead and they created a loophole. And so I'm wondering, what can we learn from this about changing the law, modifying and modulating our practice based on the argument that if we continue at this rate, we won't continue to exist. That we'll be throwing out maybe the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah, I mean, sustainability is an interesting idea generally. How the Torah deals with sustainability. I mean, are you talking about sustainability in terms of fairness of law, or are you talking about it in terms of dividing the property?
Well, I mean, again, Jethro says it the best. He says that if you continue doing this, you wear yourself out and the people as well. The task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it. So I'm not talking about sustainability in a fairness mode, and I'm certainly not talking about it in an ecological way. What I'm talking about is an institution, a custom, a practice, a law that if one continues doing it, life will cease as we know it. Other issues, the case of interest, where either the farmers will not be able to run their businesses, or they'll be forced to break the law. In the case of Zelophehad's daughter, as you point out, the whole integrity of the tribal system and the allocation will not last. So you have a choice. Either you say, well, this is the way it's written, and we'll have to give up on this sense of having the allocation for each tribe. The point is you can't have it both. It's a catch-22. It's a social institution that cannot persevere. It cannot continue going in the direction that it's going. It's not practical. Maybe it's an argument from practicality that I'm trying to say.
Yeah, maybe the word is practicality rather than sustainability.
So what is there? Is there something there? In other words, I brought the example of taking interest, but are there other instances where, I've brought up before this concept of Tirzah de Tzibur, that, or Gezeresh lo akihila lihola modbo. There are rules that are given that if the determination is made, it's too difficult, it's too stark. We can't go on this way. Is that more widespread in the development of Jewish law in your mind?
I think that that's a very important idea in Jewish law. The idea that if people can't handle it, you can't institute such a law is a very important principle in Judaism. That's what you call practicality and sustainability. If the system is not sustainable because the people just can't rise to the occasion. Geoffrey, take the simplest example. In the diaspora, we have 2 days of every holiday. For whatever reason, we have 2 days of every holiday, except for Yom Kippur. Why don't we have 2 days of Yom Kippur? It's because it's not sustainable. People can't fast for 2 days of Yom Kippur, right? That's a perfect example. We should have 2 days of Yom Kippur, but it's not practical. The system can't survive that way.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful example. It's kind of where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. It makes you wonder. And again, this is a question that people will have to, use nuance for. When does it become something that is too difficult? Clearly, if you have a rule that maybe was fine in the past, but people are finding too difficult, that's another question. Can something become unsustainable? I see that Peter Robbins is here. So, Peter, you are on the stage, and I'd love to hear your opinion.
I think you're going down a slippery slope. Where does mutability, sustainability, and slippery slope are intermingled? And I give kudos to your definition of rigid laws being changed because they're not sustainable. But I start out by asking the question, if you ask God a question, how do you know what the response is? And where I end up is that your conscience becomes the response. The question of sustainable and mutability, though, is a slippery slope, and I just wonder how diluted the tenets become when they become changed.
I think you're asking two questions, and they're two great questions. The easier question is, how do you know that it's God speaking? Is this just a ruse? Is this just a face-saving technique that can be used? And when can it be used? Does it disappear with the end of prophecy, or is there a statute of limitations? I think that's a great question. And of course, the slippery slope part of it is the question of used and abused. Who decides? And I think I was going in that direction kind of when I was saying, so at what point do Jews come and say, walking to shul is not sustainable. We used to live in urban areas, or we used to live before the car and the highway, and now we're spread out. And, can we ride to shul? And of course, I think there are movements within Judaism that have argued that that's precisely where one has to use an argument like this. But clearly it is a slippery slope, especially if you're an Orthodox rabbi. So, Adam, what is your response?
I mean, slippery slope is a tricky business. That, I understand what Peter is saying. You have to be able to draw lines, but you also need to have flexibility. If you don't have flexibility in the system, then the system is going to fall apart. So you talk about walking to shul. The conservative movement in 1960 decided that the movement was not going to survive unless they allowed for driving to shul on Shabbos. 60 years later, they now write and they say that the conservative movement made a mistake, that they lost community. The Orthodoxy maintained community because people had to live close by. The conservative movement lost community there. So they made a mistake in the sense of, figuring out the slippery slope or whether it was practical. And I think that's so interesting that they actually, that's the consideration. That's what we think about now. Did they go too far? Did they fall down that slippery slope? What do you think, Geoffrey? Do you think the conservative movement fell down that slippery slope?
Well, I do think that in addition to being a slippery slope, there's the issue of unintended consequences. And I think that there is no question that if one was to make a determination that riding to synagogue is a necessary evil, one would have to do it with their eyes wide open. And when I say that, I mean that clearly the optimal situation is that maybe we have smaller synagogues, that people, even in a suburban or rural area, can live closer to. And if you're too far away to walk, you start another synagogue. And I do think that that is a solution that is very positive. So there are alternative solutions to every problem, and definitely one needs to think. But I think my answer to you is sometimes you need an experiment like that. In other words, you cannot always know what the unintended consequences are, and so you need to be flexible enough to try something, and then have the self-confidence to admit when a mistake was made.
That's a big deal, Geoffrey. That's not so easy for people, To admit mistakes is hard.
Especially if you're in the God business, I guess.
I guess that's right. Peter, what do you want to say?
Yeah, Geoffrey and Rabbi, I think that slippery slope is I think, harsh. My takeaway from the conversation between and among the two of you is that survival of the religion and its people trumps any type of rigidity. That morphing into adaptability becomes the imperative.
Well, I think maybe it's more of an art than a science. And I do think that the takeaway for me is that you have to ask, when you have to speak up, no matter what position in the society you hold. You don't have to be a leader. You can be a woman. You can be on the periphery. You can be a well-meaning non-Jew. You can be someone who's quote-unquote unclean. That's the takeaway to me, and that you need to be flexible and try. And if there's a mistake that gets made, I think, you just have to have the self-confidence to admit it. I do think, though, that if we're going to talk about something that is very meaningful and relates very much to the ability of the Jewish people to survive, we have another direction that we can go in our discussion today in terms of the Daughters of Zelophechad. And the direction that I want to take us in is this is the first instance of women arguing for a matrilineal society, meaning to say the assumption of these daughters was that they lived in a patrilineal society, and their father died, and there was not going to be any inheritance to them, and his name would no longer go on, and that you certainly couldn't pass on his tribal affiliation through them. And I know the traditional answer will be, well, whether you're a Cohen, Levi, or Yisrael goes through your father, but whether you're Jewish goes through your mother. And what I would love to spend the rest of our afternoon discussing is the fact that that's not altogether clear, number one, and number two, that you could make a case that this is the only instance that we see in biblical Judaism, in the Torah Judaism, that women were given some ability under a certain circumstance to be able to exercise a matrilineal descent. And I'd like to quote a Mishnah, and of course the Mishnah is now 1st, 2nd century, so many, many years after this instance. And again, you'll hear in the Mishnah that matrilineal descent is only for certain circumstances. So the Mishnah says as follows: every place that there is a kiddushin and there is no sin, the child goes after the male. And it goes ahead and it gives many examples. So the ones that I just gave, where the father is a Cohen, where the father is a Levite, so forth and so on. And then it goes on to say, however, in a case where there is a sin, whether it's a question of a Cohen who's not allowed to marry a divorced woman or a widow, or someone who marries somebody who's a Gibonite, it makes a whole long list. And at the end of the list, it says that this one who engages with forbidden intercourse, according to the Torah, cannot join in marriage with that person. In that situation, the child goes after the mother. So if you hold in your mind the situation of Zelophehad's daughters, where they were in a situation where it could not continue through the males, so it had to be tweaked to go for the females, I think, and of course this is not the place to have a very deep textual understanding of the text, but what the text actually is saying, that any case where the kiddushin, the marriage, cannot be fulfilled, such as with a non-Jew, in that case the child goes after the mother. And so this is absolutely radical for us, because we seem to believe that in every instance Judaism goes through the mother, where the Mishnah is saying that, similar to the case of Zelophehad's daughter, that was an exception with extenuating circumstances, so too matrilineal descent is based on an extenuating circumstance, where, and now I'll paint it in much more social context. A girl gets raped, and she can't live with she's not accepted by the Canaanites or whatever. And rather than have her not affiliated with anybody, the rabbis say your child is yours and it's Jewish. And that, to me, is the clear reading of this text. So, Rabbi, what is your sense of the history of this unquestioned belief that we seem to have, that Judaism, in all cases, goes after the mother?
Yes, so that is of course fascinating. Now, you have to believe that the reason for matrilineal descent goes back, Geoffrey, to something you said at the beginning, and that is about being practical. And that is, you always know who the mother is. You don't always know who the father is. Right? That's a very important consideration. So if you had to determine what the lineage is. I know what the lineage through the mother is. I don't necessarily know what the lineage through the father is. So therefore, the default seems to be that you go through the mother matrilineal rather than patrilineal descent.
So I think that that's an explanation that I've heard before, and clearly, correct me if I'm wrong, but when somebody is, God forbid, sick, and we make a prayer for them for the reason that you just raised,
we know for sure who the mother is.
You know, so there's no question that there is a strong basis for your argument. Alternatively, you cannot say that passing on one's tribal affiliation is meaningless. So, if in fact we are willing to overlook this surety that we get from the mother when it comes to all sorts of things, inheritance law, tribal affiliation, one could ask, why was there this disconnect for being Jewish? And of course, you could argue, well, Judaism is your religion is much more important. But I would argue that while it's a good argument that you're making, it's clear from this text that when the rabbis instituted this situation or instance of matrilineal descent, it was for this specific instance. And I just want to say that when I grew up and the Reform movement came out and said that they were willing to accept patrilineal descent, meaning to say that in Reform Judaism, I think I'm correct in saying that whether your father is Jewish or your mother is Jewish, if one of the parents is Jewish, the kid is Jewish, we all went up in arms. We said that they were going to rip Judaism apart, and so forth and so on. It was a higher bar than when they said, maybe you can light a fire on Shabbat or something. When I did some research, I found, and it blew me away, that the Reform movement actually wrote a traditional responsa. And in that responsa, they quoted the piece of Mishnah that I just said, and one other. And they said, the report offers a sociological interpretation of the reason for matrilineal descent in illicit unions. The woman with her child had no recourse but to return to her own people. So it's amazing to me. Number one, I have to give credit to the Reform movement for actually going to the trouble of writing a traditional responsa. But I also believe that they were saying something, that just as the case of Zelophehad's daughter, a social situation prompted God, prompted Moses, his spokesman, to make a change. In the case of matrilineal descent, it was a beautiful thing in its day. But it somehow totally eclipsed the more natural, the more widespread patrilineal descent. And I was a member of Rabbi Riskin's synagogue, Lincoln Square at that time. And I remember, and I've Googled articles that he wrote against these Reform rabbis. Fast forward 30 years, Rabbi Riskin is now living in Israel. And an Israeli soldier whose parents came from the Soviet Union was tragically killed in battle. And his name was Lev Pascal, and he died in the Lebanon War. And he was about to be buried in the military cemetery, which is a Jewish cemetery. And all of a sudden, the military rabbi said, no, his mother was not Jewish. He cannot be buried. And unlike a situation that might have occurred like this in any other town or instance in Israel, when it came out to the public universally around Israel said, here is a man, a young boy who gave his life for the state of Israel, and you are trying to deny him the ability to be buried in the military cemetery. And at that point, rabbis such as Rabbi Riskin started to delve into the texts, and lo and behold, they started to come up with arguments that there is something to patrilineal descent. I'm going to stop before I actually start bringing some of the arguments. But Rabbi, where are you in this argument? Is this something that is dynamic at this point? Is there some movement here?
So I mean, that story, that Rabbi Riskin story, is a very powerful story. I mean, I think the answer is it dynamic? The answer is yes, it's dynamic. But I want to go back, Geoffrey, to how you started. And you said that when you were a member of Lincoln Square Synagogue and the Reform movement said that, you know, they accept either patrilineal or matrilineal descent, that everybody was up in arms. The reason they were up in arms is because they were afraid that all of a sudden we were defining Judaism differently for different groups of people. Means you could be Jewish you could be reformly Jewish, but not conservative or Orthodox Jewish. And they became very much afraid of that. That at the very least, the definition of what it means to be Jewish needs to be standard for everybody. So I think that even though, of course, what Rabbi Riskin found out and the fact that there is room for patrilineal descent, but I think the idea that when you go out on a date, you have to wonder, are you Jewish according to the Reform movement, Jewish according to the conservative movement, or Jewish according to the Orthodox movement, I think makes it complicated. Doesn't mean it's impossible, and maybe long-term, Judaism, American diaspora Judaism, is going to have to address these issues, because these are the issues that have to be talked about by everybody, because we can't have a situation where you're Jewish for one and not Jewish for another.
Can I ask a question here?
Of course.
What is the definition of a Jew under the law of return?
I believe it's one grandparent. And I might, and I'll go further than that and say that the state of Israel took the same law as Lahavdil Elef Havdalot Hitler took. Hitler would kill you if you had one Jewish grandparent, and I don't know if there's a connection or not, but the state of Israel would accept you if you have one Jewish grandparent.
Why wouldn't the religion take the same point of view?
Well, because the religion in church and state in Israel are so close, are divided and close at the same time. And of course, the religion follows the halachic, the legal thinking, and one has to formulate a legal argument. So we only have a few more minutes. Let me just tell you what Rabbi Riskin came up with. He found that the first Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel made the following ruling. He said, if your father is Jewish and your mother is not, you are clearly, you can't look at that person the way you would look at someone who had no connection to Judaism at all. And when that person decides to come back, Choser hayeled leika zaro. That child is coming back he's coming home. And so unlike when someone converts, they have to go through all these classes and they have to agree to accept all the laws and all of that. This rabbi said, it's different. And of course, Rabbi Riskin said, and that is the way it should be in Israel for a soldier, but it doesn't work in the diaspora. The point that I'm trying to make is this is an area like any area in Judaism that you can ask questions and you can get surprising answers. And I think that ultimately is the lesson that we have to learn from the Daughters of Zelophechad. And more to the point, we don't ask just intellectual questions, but questions that affect people's lives. And I think with regard to intermarriage, clearly in terms of American Jews, it was during the Gaza war, so it got lost in the news, but the new Pew study came out. And if you take away the Orthodox community, 75% of the Jewish community is now intermarrying, but more to the point, more than 50% of them are raising their children in some level of Judaism. So I think in terms of sustainability of our people, but also the human issue, the social issue, we're entitled to ask these questions, to have these discussions, and to know that there is never a black and white answer. And that is my takeaway from the Daughters of Zelophechad.
Thank you. That was really a very good takeaway. I thought this was a great conversation. Thank you, Geoffrey. Something to think about for all of us. Shabbat shalom to everybody. Happy July 4th. I look forward to seeing everybody next week.
You got it. Shabbat shalom. Thanks for joining.
Bye-bye.